Thank you. Cheers. I'm really relieved about something, which is that you've got this kind of microphone. Because I had this weird experience when I had to do my TED Talk where they make you wear, you know, those things that you put on your head, a head mic. And I remember saying to the technician as he put this on, oh, if you make me wear this, I'm going to feel like Madonna. And he looked at me really intensely and he said, you should always feel like Madonna. And so now, whenever I have to wear one of those things, I always get this really strong urge to just burst into Papa Don't Preach. So I don't feel that urge now, thankfully. I'm really chuffed to be here for lots of reasons. The thing I want to talk to you about is, I know there's a debate in New Zealand about how much you guys should be involved in advocacy and arguing for change. And I think that we've had a problem across the world where for a long time addiction treatment has focused only on isolated individuals. And I think you guys are part of a move away from that, or not away from it, but expanding it. Obviously talking about the individual is really important. And the thing I want to talk to you about is how powerful all of you are and what you can achieve. And I think you can achieve something amazing here in New Zealand. And I want to tell you why, really, and based on what I've learned. I don't think you need me to tell you most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, but I think it might help to know about what some people have done in other places. So, as some of you will know from stuff I've talked about before, for me this was a very personal issue, finding out about addiction. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and I didn't understand I was too young then to really understand what was going on, but as I got older I realized we had drug addiction in my family, quite a few members in my family. And when it got to the point where I started researching this subject about 8 years ago, you know, some people I love were in a really bad way, and I was really confused. And I think one of the reasons why the debate about the war on drugs is so charged is because actually I think almost all of us have, it kind of runs through the hearts of all of us. Almost all of us have both sides of the drug war inside us. If we're honest, if anyone here who's had someone they love with an addiction problem or has had an addiction problem themselves, there was a big part of me that was just really angry, right? There was a kind of little mini drug warrior that just thought, God, someone should just stop you. Why are you doing this? And then, of course, there was a part of me that thought, that doesn't seem to be working very well. How can I be more compassionate? How can I be more loving? And I wanted to figure out, well, which of these strategies work? What can we actually do? So I ended up going on a quite long journey across the world. I didn't realize how long it would take at the start. I ended up crossing over 30,000 miles and sitting with just people in very different places and scientists and just people whose lives have been changed, from a transgender crack dealer in Brooklyn, who's one of the smartest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartels, who's not one of the smartest people I know, to you know, a scientist who was spending a lot of time giving psychedelics to mongooses to see if they like them. Ask me afterwards. And I learned lots of things, but to me, the heart of it, one of the key parts of it, which I think leads to something that I want to talk to you about, is I realized that I had profoundly misunderstood what addiction is. If you'd asked me when I started doing this research, what causes, for example, heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were thick, and I would have said, well, the clue's in the name, right? Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told this story for 100 years. That's become totally part of our common sense. I thought I had literally seen it play out in front of me. We think, okay, we're here in Rotorua. We think if any of us walked out, you know, a lot of people think, if we walked out onto this street and we ignored the slightly weird smell, and we kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past this building, and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month, like some kind of villain in a Saw movie, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason, that there are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically need, and at the end of it, they'd have this terrible physical hunger for these hooks. There's a reason why we call it being hooked, right? And we think that's what addiction is. That's what I believed. First thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about that story is when I'm obviously British. In Britain, lots of doctors explained to me, in Britain, if you step out into the street and you get hit by a truck and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine for the pain. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's much better heroin than you're ever going to score on the streets because it's medically pure, right? if any of you have a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken a lot of heroin, right? If what we think about addiction is right, and this is given for quite long periods of time in British hospitals, if what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these people in hospitals in Britain, right? Significant numbers of them should be leaving hospital trying to score on the streets. There have been studies of this. It never happens, right? There are no known instances of it. And when I learned that, it just seemed completely bizarre to me. How can it be that you have one person in a hospital bed being given loads of strong heroin and they never become addicted, and then you have someone in an alleyway outside using on the street, using actually a weaker kind of heroin, who does become addicted? I frankly didn't believe it, but I kept interviewing these doctors, I kept looking at the scientific studies, and I was like, what's going on here? And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that's helped us to think very differently about addiction. So Professor Alexander explained to me, this story we have in our heads about addiction being caused by the chemical hooks comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can try them at home if you're feeling a little bit sadistic. You take a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself within about a week or 2 weeks, right? So there you go, that's our story. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander started looking at these experiments, and he was like, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing to do except use these drugs. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat can want in life, it's there in Rat Park, right? And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And of course, they try both. They don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They don't use it very much. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So when you have rats who do not have the things that make life meaningful to them, you get 100% compulsive use and overdose almost. And when they have the things that make life meaningful and good to them, you don't have that. And there's lots of human examples, I'm going to get to some in a minute, but the thing I took from this as I learned about it is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, important though that is for some people. The opposite of addiction is connection. Connection to the things that make life meaningful. I'll give a couple of human examples quickly. There was a human experiment happening at the exact same time as Rat Park in the same principle. You've probably heard of it. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of American troops were using shitloads of heroin, right? And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were absolutely terrified because they believed the chemical hooks theory of addiction. So they were like, well, these people who are using all this heroin in Vietnam, these troops, when they come home, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts on the streets of the United States. What can we do? Real panic in the Nixon White House about this. What happened to all those troops? There was a very good study that followed them home for the Archives of General Psychiatry by a psychiatrist called Lee Robbins. Followed them home from the jungles of Vietnam to back in their lives. What happened to them? Turns out 95% of them just stopped using heroin. They didn't go into, it didn't even get treatment, right? Now that seems completely bizarre if you believe the old theory of addiction, right? That it's caused by the drug enslaves you, it takes you over. But when you understand this different way about thinking about addiction, it makes perfect sense. Any of us, if I took you now and put you in a horrific jungle in Vietnam where you had to kill people and could die at any moment, we would all find heroin a lot more appealing than we do now. And then when we came back to we'd find an anesthetic very appealing. And when we came back to our lives, where we have meaning and connection and purpose, we would find it a lot less appealing again. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life, because your life is too painful a place to be. And once you understand that, you can see what we've been getting so wrong for so many years. Because the drug prohibition, the war on drugs, which plays out here in New Zealand, plays out in my country, plays out in most parts of the world, is based on a different idea. Firstly, it's based on the idea the drug is the main cause of the problem, so we've got to try to keep the drug out of the country. I was just speaking to some people who work in prisons in New Zealand. You can't even keep them out of your prisons, where you pay someone to walk around the wall the whole time, so good luck keeping it out of the whole country. So it's partly that idea, but it's also based on the idea that when someone's got an addiction problem, we need to impose more pain on them in order to give them an incentive to stop. But once you understand that pain is the driver of addiction, you can see what that does. Sometimes people say, oh, the war on drugs, prohibition, they don't work when it comes to addiction. The truth is much worse than that. They make the problem worse. They put barriers between people and reconnection. They make people more shamed, more stigmatized, and more traumatized. I went out in Arizona with a group of women who were made to go out on a chain gang wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict, while members of the public mock them and jeer at them, right? It's not true to say that fails with those women. Those women leave prison even more broken, even more traumatized. It makes their addiction worse, right? I went to the places that have the harshest possible policies towards drug users. In Vietnam, I met people who've been, what they do is about 14 years ago, people with addiction problems just started to disappear off the streets of Vietnam. No one knew where they were. Even their families. Turned out they were sent to forced labor camps, and they started to re-emerge about 6 months later, where they were made to just tortured and made to do forced labor, right? What happened? According to the best study we got of this, 99% of them relapse in the first week, right? No one here is surprised by that. And what happens in Vietnam now? They've got a massive and growing crisis, just like they do in Arizona, just like they do everywhere where the main approach is punishment, shame, and stigma. So I just want to say one other thing about chemical hooks, which is important. It's not that chemical hooks aren't real, right? There are people in this room who've been through heroin withdrawal. You don't need me to tell you that chemical hooks are real. We can measure how much of addiction chemical hooks are caused by chemical hooks. In the 1990s, there was this experiment that some people in this room, I'm sure, took part in. So we know that when it comes to tobacco smoking, cigarette smoking, which my mother does constantly, my mother smokes 70 cigarettes a day, and there's this amazing photograph of me and my mother when I'm 6 months old. She's breastfeeding me, smoking, and resting the ashtray on my stomach. And when I found this photo about a year ago and I showed it to her, she said, "You were a difficult baby, I needed that cigarette." But so people like my mother, there's this great optimism in the 1990s because we know the chemical hook in tobacco is nicotine, right? That's the thing that you physically crave when you've got a cigarette addiction. And in the late 80s, but it goes on the market in the early 90s, they invented nicotine patches, which give you all of the chemical hook you're addicted to. Any of you who are smokers, put on a nicotine patch, your physical hunger for the nicotine is being met, right? So at the time, because people believed this chemical hooks theory entirely, thought it was the whole story, there was this huge wave of optimism. People were like, great, everyone who smokes is going to start wearing the nicotine patches and stop. What happened? Best research on this was by the US Surgeon General. They found that 17% of people given nicotine patches and a motivation to stop will stop smoking. It's important to say 17% is not nothing, right? That's a lot. That's a lot of people who would have died who've otherwise lived. But it's also important to say that leaves another 83% that's got to be explained some other way. What is the other 83%? And I think I helped to see it partly when I went to some of the other countries that have been experimenting with drug policy. So I went into Portugal. In the year 2000, Portugal had the worst drug problem in Europe, one of the worst in the world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. And every year, they tried the punishment, shame, and stigma approach you guys have in New Zealand more and more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, they shamed more people, they gave more people criminal records, and every year the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together, and they were like, look, we can't go on like this with ever more people becoming addicted to heroin in our country. What are we going to do? It got to a point where everyone in Portugal knew someone with a heroin addiction. And they asked me not to give away too many details about this, but some very senior politicians had very close relatives who had heroin addictions. So they decided to do something really bold, something really original, no one had done in more than 70 years since the global war on drugs began. They said, should we ask some scientists what we should do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know called Dr. Huao Gulao. And they said to this panel, you guys go away, look at all the science you can, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, and we've agreed in advance with all the other political parties, we're going to do whatever you recommend. So the panel goes away, it looks at all the evidence, including Rat Park, and they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything, but, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on screwing people's lives up, punishing them, shaming them, imprisoning them, all of that stuff, and spend all that money instead on turning their lives around. And it was a mixed program. Part of it was residential rehab and therapy. Big part of it was job creation. If you had an addiction problem and say you used to be a mechanic, they'd go to a garage and they'd say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. They set up a program of small loans for people with addiction problems to set up small businesses about things they wanted to do. The goal was to say to every person with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And by the time I went to Portugal, it was 13 years since this had begun and the results were in. Injecting drug use was down by 80%. Addiction was massively down. Overdose deaths were massively down. HIV transmission was massively down. Street crime was massively down. And one of the ways you know this works so well is that virtually nobody in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed the guy who led the opposition to the decriminalization at the time. He was the top drug cop. His name was João Figueira. And he said to me, so at the time he said, totally understandably, he said, look, if we decriminalize all drugs, we're going to have an explosion in drug use, we're going to have an explosion in kids using drugs, we're going to have all sorts of problems. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt really ashamed that he'd spent 20 years prior to the decriminalization making people's lives worse when that money could have been used to turn people's lives around. And I think there's a lot we can take from Portugal. Firstly, you can literally import this model, right? It has worked incredibly well. But I also think that there are other places that have experimented that have also done really interesting things that I think are worth thinking about. So Switzerland is a really my dad's from Switzerland. Switzerland's a really conservative country, right? And they had in the 90s a big heroin crisis. Some of you will remember terrible images of mass drug use in public parks, people injecting themselves in the neck, horror stories, right? Which really did happen. And then just after the year 2000, Switzerland got its first ever female president, a woman called Ruth Dreifuss. I know you guys led the world on female leaders, but for Switzerland, this is a big deal, right? And Ruth Dreifuss, who'd been the health minister, explained to Swiss people something that at first seemed quite shocking. She said what she wanted to do was legalize heroin for people with addiction problems. And she said to Swiss people, I know that when you hear the word legalization, what you picture is anarchy and chaos. What we have now is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown, unhelped drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence, disease, and chaos. What legalization does is restore order to that chaos. Now, obviously, she was not proposing to legalize heroin the way that, the way we legalize alcohol, right? No one thinks there should be a heroin aisle in your local pharmacy, right? It's not how it works. So the way it works is, I went to the clinic in Geneva where they do this. By the way, the former president lives opposite that clinic, which I think tells you something about Switzerland and about her. But so clinic in Geneva, if you've got an addiction problem, heroin addiction problem, you're assigned to this clinic. You're given your heroin there. Obviously, it's medically pure, not the contaminated stuff you get on the street. You can't take it out with you because they watch you while you use it to make sure you don't overdose. And then you leave to go to your job because you're given massive amounts of support to get therapy, housing, work. So they do two things. They give people the drug they're addicted to, and they give them massive amounts of support until they no longer feel they need that drug, right? And one thing that was kind of challenging to me is on that program in Switzerland, they'll give you any dose you want except one that would kill you, and there is never any pressure to cut back. But when I went there, it had been up in place for 12 years, and there was like a handful of people who'd been on the program at the start who were still there. So almost everyone does cut back over time and stop. And I said, partly because I still had this chemical hooks theory in my head, I said to the psychiatrist who runs it, an amazing woman called Rita Mangi, but how can this be? We're told that you have this physical hunger, you need more and more of it, the hooks take you over. Surely if you just give it to people forever, they'll just carry on forever. And she looked at me like I was a bit kind of stupid, and she said, yeah, but their lives get better. And as their lives get better, they don't want to be anesthetized so much. This was the key. Give the drug and give the support until they don't need the drug, right? It's the exact opposite of what they do in the United States, for example, where they're now having an opioid crisis so extreme the average white male life expectancy has fallen in the United States in the last year for the first time since the Civil War, right? The Vietnam War didn't dent that life expectancy the way the opioid crisis currently has. And again, the key thing I think we need to take from this is, everywhere that adopts shame and punishment-based approaches has disastrous outcomes. Every outcome you can want and care about, recovery from addiction, death while people are addicted, street crime, all of these things get worse and worse the more you intensify that policy. And everywhere that has a compassion, love, and regulation-based approach sees those problems diminish. It's not a magic bullet. They've still got problems in Switzerland and Portugal. But, like I say, Switzerland is really conservative. This was extremely controversial when they introduced it. And then it was in place for a year, and they had a referendum. And 70% of Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal. Not because they're particularly compassionate. They're not, to be honest. It was because there was such a big fall in crime, right? Such a big fall in street crime. It saved them so much money because it costs a fortune to spend the police constantly chasing people around, harassing them, imprisoning them, lawyers. Prisons are insanely expensive ways of making people worse, right? Whereas the heroin program is, it costs money, but it's much, much cheaper than all of that stuff. So I wanted to just talk about a few other things because there's a person I think I've been thinking about a lot lately. Ever since I met him, I've thought about him a lot, but I think has a really important lesson for New Zealand. So in the year 2000, there was a homeless guy with a quite severe addiction problem living in Vancouver whose name was Bud Osborne. And he lived in a place called the Downtown East Side, which is a kind of notorious part of Vancouver, had a massive addiction crisis, hundreds of people dying of overdoses every year. And it's kind of area that everyone was frightened of in Vancouver. People would call it the jungle, right? And Bud was living on the streets there. And at that time, there was a really intense police crackdown on drug users generally. And Bud was just watching his friends die all around him, right? Overdoses happening. Every other day he'd learn that someone else he knew had OD'd. One day he discovered that a friend of his he knew who had young children had died of an overdose. And Bud was devastated, but he also thought, this is the language he would have used about himself at the time, I'm just a homeless junkie, what am I going to do, right? And one day, Bud had an idea. So when people would shoot up on the Downtown East Side or use other drugs, they would generally hide behind dumpsters or whatever, obviously because they were trying to hide from the police. So Bud had this idea. He gathered together a group of the homeless people with addiction problems, and he said, when we're not using, which is most of the time even for quite hardcore users, he said, why don't we just drop a timetable and we'll go and look in the places we know we hide, right? So we'll go and look behind the dumpsters, we'll go, this particular homeless, this particular empty house, that kind of thing. And people were a bit skeptical. There were a lot of people who would turn up in the Downtown East Side and announce they had solutions. But obviously Bud was one of them. They knew him, they loved him. And so people decided to try it. And then something really surprising happened. The next few months while they were doing this, the death toll on the Downtown East Side really significantly fell, which was amazing, partly because mainly because people who would have died were actually living, but it also meant that the homeless street users started to have this change in how they thought about themselves, right? They started to think, maybe we're not the pieces of crap everyone says we are. We can do something, right? And they decided, well, what else could we do? What else could we do that would save lives? Bud went to the local library on the Downtown East Side, and he started trying to read about this, and he discovered that in Frankfurt, in Germany, they'd opened safe injection spaces for people with addiction problems, and this had massively reduced the death toll. So he was like, great, we should do that in Vancouver. No one had done this in North America in 70 years. He said, well, we'll set up a group. It was called VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. We're going to persuade our mayor. The mayor at the time was a guy called Philip Owen, who was a right-winger who ran for office saying all drug addicts should be taken and detained at the local military base and never let out, right? He was an unlikely ally. And they thought, okay, well, we're going to persuade him, or we'll persuade the next mayor, but we'll start, right? So this group decided that everywhere Philip Owen went in public, they were going to follow him with a coffin. And the coffin had written on it, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injection site, right? Every time he spoke in public, one of them stood up and said, who's going to die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injection site? This went on for 2 years. At one of the meetings where he stood up, one of them, Dean Wilson, said, do you remember Julia, who a few meetings ago said, who will die next before you open a safe injection site? Turned out to be her, because you haven't done it. And Philip Owen was from a really rich family. He was a very privileged guy, a right-wing guy. He had no idea what this was about. He was puzzled. And to his eternal credit, after 2 years of harassment, Philip Owen just said, what is this? Who are these people? And just said, just introduce me to loads of drug addicts, right? So he met loads of people with addiction problems. He spent a load of time with them over quite a long period. And it blew his mind, right? He thought these were just like people who partied too hard and were indulging themselves. He was like, oh, wait, that's not at all what's going on here. And Philip Owen decided to go and meet with Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who had grown up under alcohol prohibition and was actually quite good on ending the drug war. And he spoke to Milton Friedman, and he came back and he called a press conference on the downtown east side. And he said, who was there? There was the coroner, the chief of police, and a representative of the addicts organization. He said, I'm never going to speak again about addiction without having these guys here with me, because they know a lot better than I do. We're going to open the first safe injection room in North America. We're going to have the most compassionate drug policies in the world. Things are going to change around here, just you wait and see. And they made the moves and they opened the first safe injection room. And Philip Owen's right-wing party was so horrified, they deselected him as their political candidate, and his entire career ended. But the guy, the right-winger they selected in his place, was beaten by a more liberal candidate who won the election. The injection room stayed open. When I went to the downtown east side, it was 10 years since that room had opened and the results were in. Overdose deaths were down by 80%, and average life expectancy on the downtown east side had improved by 10 years. You don't get figures like that except when a war ends, which is what this was. And I went to go and see Philip Owen, and we sat on the downtown east side in this cafe, and he told me it was the proudest thing he'd ever done. And he would sacrifice his entire political career all over again to do this. He said, how many times in your life do you get to save the lives of thousands of the most vulnerable people in your society? And, I think about this a lot because, this is a hard fight for us, right? We're up against very powerful forces. And in some ways, the drug war is going forward. The legalization of cannabis is progressing across the world. In some ways, it's going horrendously backwards. You don't need me to tell you about the war in the Philippines, for example. But sometimes I get pessimistic. I think, it's been going on for 100 years, And then I think about Bud, right? The homeless guy with an addiction problem who starts that movement. The right-wing government that they just got rid of in Canada and replaced by Justin Trudeau, the world's most good-looking man, was the right-wing government before him tried to shut down that injection site, and it went all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. And the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that people with addiction problems have a right to life, and that includes a safe place to use drugs. That will never be taken away now. It can't be, right? And I think about this, and I think, okay, it's hard to imagine a more powerless person than Bud at the start of that story, right? He was literally living on the streets. Every single person in this room is much more powerful than Bud was on that day. He didn't sit there thinking, someone else is going to have to deal with this. He didn't sit there thinking, we're never going to change anything. He started where he stood. He appealed to the goodness and decency of the people around him. And that appeal to goodness and decency kind of spread out like a circle from those people, right? They changed the way people in Vancouver thought about addiction. They changed it permanently. You are all powerful. You are all in a position where you can appeal to the people around you. This is a compassionate country. You can appeal to the people around you. Every day we do that, we bring closer the day when this war ends. And every day we wait, we condemn more people to die and more people to terrible, miserable lives when they could be having good lives because we help them and because lots of people help them. This is a battle that can be won. You won't even I've been doing TV stuff while I've been here, and one of the things the producers always say to me is, who can we get to be the other side? Because they can't find anyone who'll defend your drug policies, right? Think about how crazy that is. You carry on doing something, and there is no one to defend it, right? That's how hollow, how stupid, how cruel what we're doing is. It is literally indefensible, right? Which is not to say there aren't, reasonable people who can disagree on some points, but so you can bring this terrible policy down, and you can bring this policy of shame down, and you can replace it with a policy based on love and compassion. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about people with addiction problems. We should have been singing love songs to them all along. Thanks. Thank you.